was totally worth it, right? It was a good service. So if you grab both, I gave you back the one from last week, which I told you to turn in because I was going to use it again, and then of course I can't leave anything be, so I made a new one. But there's a prayer on top of the one that says, it should say have a 4 on the top, and then covenant 2. Well, that's the prayer that we will pray. So please pray with me. O Most High, when you came down and confused the tongues at Babel, you divided us. But when you gave tongues of fire to the apostles, you called us to unity. Renew in us this fire of unity so that all may be one and praise you with one voice. Amen. So we're talking about covenant, and the first thing I highlight for you, if you went to the service already, I think most of you were there, we had this, of course, this great Bach group, and we got the lyrics. If you have this little sheet, I wanted to highlight something. Aria number 9. The translation could be better, and I just want to point it out. But it's got a covenant reference in it. That's what I thought would be worth pointing out. So, Aria number 9. So it's on the page 3 of the folded sheet. The German reads something like, I want to sing of Jesus' wonders and bring to him the offering of the lips. He will strongly compel the weak flesh, the earthly mouth, through holy fire, according to his loving covenant, or towards his loving covenant. Right, so we get that word boon there is actually covenant. So Bach knew what he was doing. Right. Yeah. That word boon, I mean, it gets translated there as what is the English that they had here? Bond, which is accurate, but in this context, it's actually a covenant, right? Anyway, I just thought I'd give that little tidbit I noticed while I was sitting there listening. So we're talking about covenant again, right? And so last week we talked about how this is sort of covenants are treaties between nations and also between people groups in the ancient Near Eastern world, right? The ones we're really focusing on are the ones between unequal parties. So the technical language for this is a suzerain, which would be a great king in the ancient Near Eastern world, makes a treaty with a vassal, right? And that actually all kinds of things in the Old Testament and in the New are actually a reference to this kind of covenant idea that's there in the ancient Near Eastern world, right? And we saw how some of these covenants work. Oftentimes when these treaties were made, there were sacrifices, rituals that kind of said this is what this agreement is. And we saw how oftentimes animals were sacrificed and cut in half, and the vassal, the weaker party, would walk in between them, basically saying, may it be to me if I break the terms of this covenant. And then we saw how God actually does this with people like Abraham, and surprisingly enough, God doesn't make Abraham walk between the sacrificed animals. God does, right? God actually takes the role of the weaker party, right? And then I argue that if we read the Bible as a whole, we actually see Jesus then doing this for us, right? Jesus is the one who suffers, right? Because other human beings broke the covenant, right? So we got all these covenant ideas on the table. So one, it's a big idea. Today I want to focus in a bit more, right? So if you take out my handout for today, I'm sorry, it's 2 pages too. The first 2 pages we're going to treat together. So if you actually go to page 2, what I've done here is I just took a page out of a book, out of a scholarly book, and typed it up on here, reproduced the same thing. And what the author was doing on this page is showing how ancient Near Eastern treaties work. So she's taken the framework for the hundreds of these treaties we have from the Hittites and the Assyrians and the Egyptians, and given us the main elements. So they always begin with a preamble in which the suzerain, the powerful king, says, here's who I am. And then there's a prologue. There's some reasons for having this covenant in the first place. Usually the suzerain has done something for the vassal. There's a story to tell. Then there's obligations or stipulations. You do this, and I'll do this, and we'll all work together. But if you don't, there's going to be consequences. That comes at the end. There's usually then some rules. You got to read this covenant every now and then. Otherwise, people are going to forget about it, right? They don't have libraries and emails and things like we do, right? They're stored in a place. They would gather people together and read it. There were usually then witnesses. In most of these other covenants, they're the gods of the other people involved. You'll get a list of like 80 different deities. If you break this covenant, these are the people who are going to come after you. And you usually then store it in the presence of these deities. So where would they keep the covenant copies? They'd keep them in the temples, right? And then finally there'd be curses and blessings. If you keep it, here's what's going to happen. If you don't, here's what's going to happen. Yep.
The curses,
yeah.
Are those like curses? Are they warnings? Are they just that kind of?
Right. There are warnings outlined. I mean, you think of like if there's a treaty between the Hittites and some little tiny kingdom, the Hittites are going to say, well, you're going to do these things. When there's a war, you'll send this many troops. You'll send tribute this often in this amount. If that other country doesn't do it, the curse is, well, we're just going to come take it then, and you won't have your independence anymore. You will just be part of our kingdom. We'll just take you over, or we'll just come wipe you out, and we'll take your people as slaves, and our people will come live here, right? It's a treaty, but it's a treaty between unequals, right? And again, the idea is God actually uses this same framework. There are curses that God tells us is going to happen. Like if you think of, we read through, see, part of the argument I want to make today is like the whole of the first couple books of the Bible are one big covenant, right? Think if you get into like Leviticus and Numbers, there's just verse after verse of rules, right? Don't get tattoos. Don't cook a goat in its own mother's milk. There's all these sort of strange rules, right? And if you do them, there's curses, right? Keep the covenant. God says, when the basic framework of this is, I will be your God and you will be my people. I will do this for you. I'm going to take care of you and defend you, God says, and then you'll obey me. If you don't, I'll give you over to your enemies, right? This is actually how Israel explains, why are we conquered by the Assyrians? Why are we conquered by the Babylonians? Because we didn't keep the covenant and God turned us over. God still rescues them, right? It's also probably, again, this is a sort of big historical scholarly point. When is all of this stuff being written down, actually? It probably comes from earlier oral history. It's actually being written down while Israel is in exile. So the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, are actually finally written pen to page rather than passed on orally when they've been taken from the promised land and they're in Babylon. Part of the reason why they're writing it all down is we're going to lose our heritage because we're out of our own homeland. We're a conquered people. Let's get it written down so we can pass it on to our kids who aren't going to Jewish schools anymore. They're going to Babylonian schools. We read the book of Daniel, where Daniel and his friends are being trained by the Persians rather than their own people, right? So this is the kind of thing that's happening, right? So like the actual hope for putting all this on paper is to say God is going to rescue us. Why? Because God keeps the covenant even when we don't. Doesn't mean there's not some consequences for us, but God's going to keep it, right? So that's how these covenants work. If you turn back to the first page, I've tried to highlight this with the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments actually come in this framework, right? So this would have made sense to people at the time. They would have read this and go, yeah, this is how all treaties work. And the 10 Commandments are a kind of a treaty, right? So the preamble, God says, who am I? I'm the Lord your God, right? He identifies himself. What did he do? What's the basis of his relationship with Israel? I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So there's a story to tell. There's a pre-existing relationship here. That's going to be the basis of the covenant, right? So what is God then gives us a whole list of stipulations, obligations. These are the 10 commandments. What's the first one? Don't have any other gods before me. That fits perfectly in an ancient Near Eastern covenant. If you're a vassal and you make a treaty with a more powerful suzerain, you can't make a one with another suzerain, because then your loyalty is conflicted. Who are you going to help when there's a war? If you got a treaty with two different people and they go to war, you're in big trouble, right?
Well, we see that today.
Oh, we see that today too, but I mean, that's the whole point of it, right? There's conflict. So the whole conflict is you can only have a treaty with a power that's higher than you. God says the same thing. If you do it with me, you can't worship other gods, right? And then he gives us all these other things, right? Don't make idols, don't bow down to them, right? Don't make wrongful use of my name. Remember the Sabbath. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. I said this the other day, but you were probably taught at some point that the commands between Israel and God were on one tablet, and the commands between people and people, like don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery, were on the other one. Probably not true. Everything was on both columns, on both tablets, because that's what you did. You made a treaty, and both parties got to keep a copy. But this is with God and Israel. So where do both of them go? They both go in the closest thing Israel has to a temple in this time period, which is the Ark. Brother actually put into the Ark, the Holy of Holies, right? Of course, that goes into the tabernacle when they build it, right? And it goes into the temple when they build that, right? So that's just how this works. So I just want to the first point is just to point out, right? If you try to read these big Old Testament passages with the knowledge of how the ancient Near Eastern world could work, this stuff just pops off the page. It just fits the culture of the time, right? And so if we want to understand it, we've got to have some knowledge of how that culture works, right? So then we also get, if we keep going here, we get a list of witnesses, right? Who are the witnesses? It's the people, right? And Moses, right? And then we get some blessings and curses that are going to come afterwards, right? After we get this whole 10 commandments, we then get all these other rules, right? And it's all throughout the rest of the first 5 books of the Bible. And then we even get rules about when to read the tablets, right? So Moses comes down with them. Things are written on both sides, and there's going to be instructions later about the reading all of them, right? So I just want to put that off to the side, right? We can do a case study on this too, right? So what I put on page 3 there is 3 different Old Testament passages, all of them which talk about covenants, and involved with these covenants are tithing, right? So the first one comes from Genesis 47. This is important because it's pre-Moses. So we think about the 10 commandments and all these other laws. This is a covenant God makes with Israel through Moses. Here's an earlier one. It's tied up with Abraham, right? So God makes an earlier covenant with Abraham. Here he's dealing with Joseph, right? One of Abraham's descendants, right? And we see that this whole covenant idea with money is pretty typical of the ancient Near East, right? So what's happened is people have come to Egypt because there's a drought and a famine, right? The people are so poor. What do we see? All of the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was so severe, and the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made them slaves, right? This was a pretty typical arrangement of, technically, when 2 unequal powers made a covenant, the unequal power, the lower one, right, basically gives all of their land to the more powerful partner, and then gets the permission to do things like farm it. But again, if you break the covenant, they can just kick you out the land or come kill you or do all these things, right? So this is actually more of an economic arrangement that's pretty typical of this era, right? So, and then what do they have to do when they harvest it? They have to give 1/5 to the Pharaoh. They get to keep the other 4/5. So yes, they can take care of themselves, but because they're now basically tenant farmers, they're farming for someone else's land. This is how this works, right? And so, and of course, Joseph is involved with all of this, right? So it's a kind of a tithe, right? We get the same thing in Deuteronomy, right, where now God is giving Israel rules, and he gives them all kinds of rules for tithing, right? So you're going to bring a tithe into the temple. You're going to tithe your grain, your wine, right? Again, why is all of this happening, right? It's because basically God has set up a tax system. If the nation is going to run, if we're going to have a temple, if we're going to have priests, this is what we need to do. We need to have ways for all of this being taken care of, right? And it's a way of showing one's obligations to God, right? And if we go down to Malachi, this is very late in the Old Testament, right? What does God tell us? For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore, you, O children of Jacob, have not perished. So that's a promise, a blessing. I don't change. I made a covenant with you. You failed to keep it over and over again. But I haven't, God says, right? Ever since the days of your ancestors, you have turned aside from my statutes and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. But you say, how shall we return? Will anyone rob God? You are robbing me. But you say, how are we robbing you in your tithes and offerings? You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, right? What I'm trying to focus here, what the tithing thing is, it's an easy way to sort of get the whole covenant idea. There's an arrangement here, right? And it comes from the secular world, right? A vassal gives money to the higher power, right? Israel's relationship with God is modeled on this framework, right? Which is why we do even have things like tithing, and it's used to support the state, but more so, and I'm using this word here as in a technical sense, the cult of Israel, right? We've got their religious practices. You need a priest, you need animals for a sacrifice. How do you pay for all of that? God arranges it, right? And it's basically a tax system based on a covenant, right? So we got all this covenant stuff under our belts a bit. It's kind of, we got a basic framework to see how it works. My question to you is, what do we do with it as people who are living in 2023 in Western Michigan, right? So how should we think about these covenants, right? So if you could look on the bottom of page 3, I've got some points. One way I could ask you all these. Well, I want to back up real quick. I just want to give you a really quick overview of thinking about the whole first couple books of the Bible. So Israel gets rescued from Egypt. They cross the Red Sea, right? All these things happen. And then they go to Mount Sinai. And what happens there? Well, the first thing God does in chapter 19 is prepare them for his coming. God's going to appear to them, right? And then he does. He instructs them by means of the 10 Commandments. He makes this covenant with them, right? In chapter 24, there's a ritual where they actually sacrifice animals and Israel walks between them, right? Then they're given instructions for how to build the tabernacle, how to have sacrifices. Then the golden calf happens where Israel breaks the covenant, right? And there's some turmoil, but then God restores it all. What do we get in the rest of Exodus? We get more rules, basically rules about how to keep the a Sabbath. Now, think about what kind of a rule a Sabbath is. It's not a moral rule. It's not like don't kill. That's a moral rule. What kind of rule is keeping the a Sabbath? Well, it's kind of that, but I mean, what's the purpose of it?
Honor God.
Right, the purpose of it is to honor God. So it's less a moral rule about not, a moral rule is we don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery. This is a relational rule. Well, it's that kind of thing, but it's also the idea of this is how I demonstrate that I'm in a relationship with God. I do this kind of thing. I mean, it's like this. Why do I wear a wedding ring? Right? It tells other people that I'm married. Right? Keeping the Sabbath was a way for Israel to say, we're God's people. We're not the people of these other gods. If you think of contemporary Orthodox Jews, right, and the way they have the big long, the men don't cut the corners of their beards. Why? Again, that's not a moral rule. It's a ritual rule or a relational rule. This indicates that this is a person who follows God under this covenant. That's part of what covenants do. They're not only moral rules, right or wrong. This demonstrates who we are in relation to other people, right? And God does this all the time. He makes covenants with people and says, you be my people, I'll be your God. Here are ways we're going to tell other people about our arrangement. You're going to do some weird stuff.
Isn't it also kind of like an expression of who you are to whoever? When we think of things.
Right, I mean, it's
an outward, you know what I'm saying?
But part of what it is actually that. It's a way of telling other people that you have this kind of a relationship with God. This is your I mean, and it perhaps makes more sense in their era than in ours in terms of we don't experience people who are worshiping other gods on a regular basis. They did. Right? So it's a way of actually saying, here's who I am. Right? So hold that idea in your head. And that's if we keep going through books like Leviticus and Numbers, this is what we get. We're getting rules that are basically outlining the parameters of God and Israel's relationship. If you want to be part of God's people, do these kinds of things. So we get rules for how to sacrifice animals, right? We get rules for how to deal with ritual cleanliness or uncleanliness, right? Again, these aren't moral things, right? We get rules for the Day of Atonement. We get all kinds of rules about how to sacrifice animals to keep them kosher. Much kosher is clearly not a moral issue, not to eat pork, right? It's a way of saying, we're not going to eat pork like all of our neighbors do. And they're going to ask, well, why don't you eat pork? And they're going to say, because God told us to. Part of these rules are actually about evangelism. It's missions. People can ask, why do you do that weird thing? And we can say, well, God told us to. What are you talking about God told you to? And you start telling them the whole story about God, how God saved us from Egypt, right?
And then I say, well, what does pork have to do?
Right. But I mean, that's the thing. It isn't a moral thing. It isn't some kind of like pork is unhealthy or eating it is evil. It's the very purpose of the rule is to say, God is asking you to do this strange thing in order to demonstrate your faithfulness. Who are you demonstrating it to? Not necessarily to God, but to other people.
There was also trichinosis.
Right. Well, I mean, that's but that's the thing. It's like I don't think this is really what's going on. It isn't a health thing either, right? It's a way of saying we're not going to do things other people do because God told us not to do them, right? So go ahead.
Well, just, I'm curious as to what your opinion is about why did God ask people to do such unusual things? Was it the nature of the time?
So I think part of it would be.
Betty Jo said, why pork?
Why
the beardy thing?
Part of it is because of their cultural, the context that they're in. So we actually can tell from archaeology, the Philistines, their favorite meat was pork. We find pig. We can go through Israel, Palestine, and start digging, and you can tell this was a Philistine village. This was an Israelite village because the Philistine village is full of pig bones. So actually, there's a huge industry for farming pigs. Israel says we're not going to be part of that, right? And part of it is just a way of saying we're different from these people because God has called. I mean, this is getting into the whole idea of holiness. If you turn to the very back page, we'll jump ahead there, right? We're really confused on holiness. Holiness does not mean being morally perfect.
So if I went, I could associate, the Israelite could associate with a Palestinian.
A Philistine, right? Yeah.
I'm sorry, with a Philistine. If so, I could go and eat with them, but I would not eat their food.
Right, exactly. And eventually it's going to get even tighter as a way of saying we're going to keep ourselves apart. Because this gets to the holiness issue. What's holiness isn't being morally perfect. It's being set apart. It's being saying we're different. Why? Because God has called us to be different. So when God says, be holy as I'm holy, I've got that box on the back page. I got a passage from Exodus, the Leviticus, and then it shows up in the New Testament too. Right? God basically says, be holy as I'm holy. It's basically be set apart as I am set apart. Don't do things the way everybody else does. Part of it is to draw attention to yourself, to say, why do you do that? And it's actually then to be able to tell the story, right? So holiness isn't about, first and foremost, about more morality. It's about good relationship with God. But it's more than that, because it's yes, it's a talking point, but it's also you have to consciously think about these things all the time. Why don't I do that thing? I mean, if you think about, I could go to the neighboring village and pork's a heck of a lot cheaper this week than beef. Why don't I go buy some pork, right? But the whole point is, perhaps, the whole idea is you're not going to do that because God has asked you not to.
It's like a child. So anyway, so if I'm an Israelite, Philistine, gentleman,
right.
and I'm eating at her house and she has pork, and I said, well, I can't eat pork.
Right.
Well, why not? Well, God told me not to. Well, why not pork? I don't know.
I mean, this is part of it. And I think there probably are reasons. I mean, in the context, some of them were probably like there was probably the industry for pork was probably deeply problematic. Was it running on slave labor, these kinds of things? So they abstain, right? So if there are probably some extraneous moral reasons, we don't have them. The Bible doesn't give them to tell us why, right? We can do archaeology
child labor
and figure it out, right? So those are those kinds of things. So here's where I want to end. I know we're close to time, right? So this is a covenant between Israel and God, with Moses as sort of the representative. So my first question to you is, are we under this covenant? No. The answer is no. This isn't for us. This is between God and Israel, right? And if you get to your New Testaments, there's actually a frequent argument that we aren't under this covenant. We're not under the Mosaic law anymore. The covenant that keeps popping up is the Abrahamic covenant that God answered with Abraham, and I'm going to make a nation out of you. The Gentiles will come to God through you, right? But that means all this Old Testament covenant isn't for us. It's for God and Israel. Now, this doesn't mean you can go start killing people, right? Because, of course, God has given us a covenant too in the New Testament. But if you, again, turn to my back page, this is from Hebrews chapter 8, right? The part that's in 2 columns, I'm just going to read there. This is basically all quotes from the Old Testament. A good deal of it is. But what does the author of Hebrews say? The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their ancestors, right? They didn't continue in my covenant. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel. I will put my laws in their minds, right? So there's all kinds of things here, but the point is God's going to make new covenants. God makes covenants throughout. And we're not necessarily under this one, which is why we are okay eating, pepperoni pizza. Because you couldn't do that if you were following the Old Testament covenant, right?
Well, better reason to be a Christian.
Right. But it is, again, the idea, there are certain things that God's going to keep. If God, God tells us in a couple of these passages, I stay the kasame. He tells us in the book of Hebrews, I am the same today, yesterday, and forever, right? We should expect things to be the same, right? But as the context change, some of the rules are going to change too. You can actually see this in the Bible. So we get the Ten Commandments in two different places, and they were probably written down a couple of hundred years apart, Exodus and Deuteronomy. In Exodus, when you get to the things about coveting, it says, don't covet your neighbor's wife. The wife is being treated as property. By the time you get to Deuteronomy, that's dropped out. And if we were going to update it for today, we should say, don't covet your neighbor's wife or your neighbor's husbands, right? Context is going to be key here, right? God doesn't come in and sort of wipe out a culture and say, do things come my way. He works within it to try to reform, right? That's the first thing. This covenant, we don't have to follow all of these rules. We can still learn a lot from it, right? So I used tithes as a case study, right? I gave you some passages on that. Well, what are tithes for? In part, they were given to the Levites and the priests. By the way, people need to go. I'm just going to take the luxury of 10 minutes, if that's okay with you. So, it's for part of it's for paying for the Levites and the priests. Well, the New Testament doesn't have Levites and priests. It's not how the church works. In fact, we're told everybody's a priest. So we don't need to have the same tithe arrangement.
What about the Jewish people today?
So, even amongst Jews today, there's arguments, right? You get the Orthodox, who you can tell who they are because they've got, they don't shave their beards and they're wearing old clothes. They think we're going to keep all of these rules, and they try to. But if you go to a Reformed Jew, which is actually the bigger group, they don't. In fact, lots of them only keep kosher during holidays. Otherwise, you can invite them over to your house to have bacon and eggs, and they're okay with that, right? Bob, you had your hand up.
This is not the time for it, but sometime can you, cover replacement theory?
Well, yeah. So we've got some of that in my notes, right? But so this is my point 3, right? So in the Old Testament, tithing is connected to the land. It's all about keeping the land, which God gives Israel under the Old Covenant. What are tithes for again? They're for upkeeping the temple. They're also for taking care of the poor. Right? So all of this is God saying, here's how we're going to structure your society to do the things we need to do. We need money for the temple. We need rules for taking care of the poor. We talked about a bunch of that last week, right? Of course, the context is widows and orphans, because in their society, these are the people who don't have anyone to take care of them. They don't have a patriarch. In a different context, we would have to have different rules, right? So again, this covenant doesn't apply to us directly as Christians. It applies to Israel, the Jews, as a nation, and with the first coming of Christ, and the church is open to Gentiles, the idea that Israel is a nation isn't the focus anymore. That doesn't mean that God doesn't still have a covenant with Israel, but if we're part of a church that's a mix, Jews and Gentiles, we've got a different covenant arrangement. And in fact, this is what we see happening in our New Testaments. They're arguing about, do these new non-Jewish Christians, do they need to get circumcised? Do they need to keep kosher? And the church argues about it, and they say, no, we're not under those covenant obligations anymore.
The Jews are?
Well, that's the whole thing. That's for them to work out. And what seems to be happening in our New Testament is people like Peter and Paul are still keeping the covenant. but they're not making other people do it, right? I mean, that's the whole issue of like, how do we get this? I mean, this is the problem on the table: is Israel's covenant that we get through Moses is tied up with them being a nation. Christianity doesn't make nations.
But Paul talks about in Romans,
So I mean, Paul's also talking about, like, he doesn't expect other people to keep these, right? What he does bring in is the Abrahamic covenant, which is now the terms of the covenant are faithfulness to God, right? And he gives us some moral rules. The Gentiles can come in, but all of these very distinctly Jewish things are basically like, these don't apply. If Jews want to keep them, that's fine, but they do need to recognize that this isn't the cause of their salvation. When we talk about salvation by grace, not by works, that's what works means. It basically means things like you're not saved through keeping kosher. Because Israel thinks, how are we saved? We're saved by keeping the covenant, and we're punished when we don't keep it. And God says now through Jesus, you're saved by faith, not by keeping rules. Right? Now, of course, if you have faith in God and Jesus, you're going to act in a certain way. You're basically going to do most of these moral things. You're not going to kill people and steal and commit adultery and those sorts of things. You should probably care for the poor, those who are oppressed, just like God gives Israel all these rules. But it's okay to eat bacon, right? Those rules don't apply, right?
So we had the equivalent of the don't eat pork rules when we were growing up. And just don't dance, don't play cards, and don't go to the theater.
Right. And I mean, and you can almost see where those rules came from, right? If at a certain point in American culture, those things involved you in things that the church thought was sinful, those are good covenant rules. If we've now moved along and said, you know what, going to see a film isn't going to corrupt you for all eternity, then maybe it's okay, right? But again, think of how that even operates. Of why aren't you going to the movie and smoking afterwards? Because I'm a Christian. It's actually a way of identifying who you are, right? So this is part of what we should still do, right? Is have ways of identifying how we are different from the rest of the world, right? But those things are going to differ from time and place. I mean, that's the point I'm trying to make is these are values rather than hard and fast rules, right? And we need to figure out how all of this then works, right? So I just want to sort of point some of these things out, right? So, and what I do say in there is, right, is just because God has said this covenant doesn't apply, doesn't mean that the church replaces Israel. Doesn't mean that God still doesn't have some kind of special arrangement with Israel, but that's not our arrangement, right? It also means that when we think of all these covenant things, we're going to divorce it from the land. The promises now through Abraham aren't about land. They're about salvation, right? And if we keep reading, right, I mean, so even the whole idea of being the earthly Jerusalem being important, right? We're flat out told in our New Testament, it's not the earthly Jerusalem that's important, it's the heavenly one, right? Which means we can take a variety of views on conflict in the Middle East. We're not bound to one side or the other. It just doesn't apply. We would have to argue where we would rely ourselves on different terms.